Hello and welcome to today's masterclass from Learning Zone 3, where we're going to be looking at some of the written exam content, more specifically the sport, raid and fit principles of training. So we're going to get right to it. The objectives, so by the end of this, what you should be able to know are those three acronyms, so sport, raid and fit. What you should also be able to do is then define each of the components that those acronyms represent, and then we should be able to evaluate the importance of a variety of principles of training in different sporting scenarios. And some of the activities that are on the way are going to be, just solidifying understanding of the principles of training, but also having you sort of read through a case study and seeing what's been ignored and what the coach could do to improve how they approach the performance training schedule. So to start with, principles of training. What are they? Well, as you can see, almost just from the picture here, pen, paper, tracking, recording, it's this effort to improve training. We're trying to make it more effective in terms of enjoyment, in terms of outcome, in terms of the process and the simplicity of everything. And although goals can vary from person to person, any sort of effective training program will lead to progress. And in order to actually attain these longer term goals and aspirations, the training program that anyone completes needs to observe these principles of training. And although they're unwritten and they're not essential or they don't have to be observed, any performer or coach that wants to elicit progress should do their best to incorporate as many of these principles of training into their planning, because it will improve the design. It will assure that progress is made. So what do we term these rules? Principles of training, for which we do have these three acronyms. So before we go further and we start talking through all of them, I'll bring your attention to activity 1 straight away, which is on the sheet. So access it, download it, print it off if you need to. But as we go through, it will be prudent of you to then take note as we approach each one. I'll also encourage you to come up with some sort of trigger phrase, I should say, or a key word from the definition. So rather than writing out the whole definition, because a lot of the time the word sort of serves as the definition, but perhaps a trigger phrase or a number or something which can help prompt your memory of each of these principles definitions. So if you haven't already, pause the video, download it, print it, access it, whatever. If you've got it, fantastic. We're going to carry on. So to start with, we are going to look at sport. We've got sport, raid, fit. We're going to start in sport. Now the acronym stands for specificity, progressive overload, reversibility, and tedium. Now some of these words might be new, such as tedium and progressive overload, but by the end of this, you should have a real solid grasp on what they all are, what they look like, and how we can incorporate them into training. Or more specifically, how you can incorporate them into your own training program, be it for your PAP, be it for your performance assessment, or just the theoretical understanding for your exam. So we're going to start off with specificity. Now this is when any training that's completed by a performer, it needs to be relevant to their sport and tailored to their own individual demands. So even if we've got this picture here of women's football, every single one of those people in that picture, be it the referee, the goalkeeper, the attacker, the defender, they're all playing in the same context, but there's different demands for their position and for the specific roles that they need to try and complete during those games. So the performer will need to assess the components of fitness that they most require, the most important ones for them and their jobs in their sport. The intensity of their sport should be prepared for. The goals of the performer need to be considered as well. So what are they trying to achieve? Oh no, we'll go one step back. What is their sport like? How should they design their plan to become the person, to become the performer that can meet those demands? Then from that, they can create some performance goals, and those goals they can start to work to during their training program. So specificity, we take a close look at the sporting context that the performer is preparing for. We set goals based on that, and the training program then leads this person towards reaching those specific goals. P and O, next up, progressive overload. This is when we introduce regular and gradual increases they add stress to the body. And that added stress breaks that body down and it encourages it, it forces it to adapt and improve. Now, as you can see from this picture, we ideally want to be on the green line, where on the arrows, we apply stress, we apply overload, which leads to this reduction in performance capabilities because the body's slightly damaged. But then it gets better, and then we overload it again, and again, and again, and gradually we have this wave of improvement. Now, if we time progressive overload incorrectly, and we put additional stress on the body while it's in a damaged state, we're not going to give it the time it needs to make those improvements. And just by adding an additional piece of overload, that's going to knock our body even further into a state of disrepair. So these gradual increases could be in speed, intensities, weights, resistance, temperature, rhythm, any sort of change that stresses the body a little bit more than last time, we consider to be an overload. Too little, and we don't see any improvements. Too much, and we see overtraining or injury. Oh, yeah, so just leave those there. So we need to add in tiny bits at the right time when our body's ready for its next challenge. So following a period of recovery and repair, that's when we introduce a little bit more. Do it at the same time as the repair phase, not good. So S, specificity, PO, progressive overload, R, reversibility. Now this picture here, what you can see is someone post leg break. So they've been in a cast on their right leg for a little bit of time, and as a result, their gastrocnemius, their calf muscle, wasn't used because they would have been on crutches. They were unable to flex and extend the ankle joint and contract that gastrocnemius. Well, although that's to do with injury, not so much training, it's almost an extreme case of reversibility, which is when, if we take prolonged breaks from training, this can lead to our systems returning to their pre-training conditions. They can go backwards. And it could be injury that causes this, but it could also be lack of motivation, availability of time, access to certain pieces of equipment. Weather could get in the way. So progressive intensity can lead to progression. Sustained intensity can lead to plateaus, but a reduction in intensity can lead to regression in capabilities. So we looked on the previous slide about progressive overload. Gradual introduction of harder things makes our body get better. But if we gradually reduced the amount of difficulty our body faces, our body's going to respond to that as well. It's going to get worse. Well, not so much worse, it's just going to adapt to its new environment, which is less challenging. And T, the final one from sport, which is tedium. And as you can see from the picture here, this chap is not very interested in his training session. Tedium is boredom, it's demotivation, it's this lack of drive within the training session itself or for the training program as a whole. So considering this principle of training, we need to ensure that repetitiveness is kept as low as possible. We need to ensure that any sort of progression that is introduced isn't too hard to put the person off. We need to make sure that there's variety in the selection of activities. Because if we sustain the same activity over again, over and over, and motivation drops, the performer's less likely to put in the same high amounts of intensity. Therefore, they're going to challenge their body less. Therefore, their body's going to reverse to pre-training capabilities. So how can we achieve the avoidance of tedium? Well, we can vary the activities, the contexts. You could do a circuit, but sometimes you might do it indoors, sometimes you might do it with a view, sometimes you might do it with other people. You can change the location. You can alter the intensities, the durations. You can even change the sport context itself. So if you're let's say a professional swimmer, yes, you need aerobic endurance, but doing endless lengths in off-season could be very demoralizing. So still challenge aerobic endurance, but get outside on a bike. Go for a run. You're still developing the same component of fitness, but in a different context to help stimulate the mind, keep that motivation and interest up. So that is sport. Now would be a great time to note this down on your activity sheet. S, Specificity. Any training completed needs to be relevant. It needs to be designed and tailored to the individual and their sport. P&O, progressive overload. These regular and gradual increases in the amount of challenge we give to our body. R, reversibility. If we stay out of training for too long, due to injury, lack of motivation, we go backwards. Our body adapts to the lower amount of challenge and stress. And then T, tedium, boredom, lack of motivation, lack of drive to continue and persist with training. So if you haven't already, get those down, come up with a trigger phrase or a word. So for tedium, it might be you put in brackets boredom. For reversibility, it could be that you put in brackets backwards. Progressive overload, challenge, specificity, individual. Right, we're going to move on to the RAID section of sport, RAID and fit. So the RAID principles, we have rest and recovery, and we can tie overtraining into there as well. We have adaptation, we have individual needs, and we have diminishing returns. Now, what you'll start to see is there are some elements of overlap between some of the principles of training, which is absolutely okay. I mean, they're only here to guide our training design. So rest, adaptation, individual needs, and diminishing returns. So first up, we have rest, recovery, and overtraining. Now, these are the planned periods of time off, not the ones that happen or they spring up because of emergencies or individual circumstances day to day. These are planned periods of time off, and these could be a day in a workout week, or it could be a month or two at a time in an annual periodized training program. So you have on season, for example, where you're competing at high intensities at the weekend, therefore your training during those competition weeks and months is of a lower intensity because you don't want to risk injury or burn out while you're meant to be preparing for your competitive scenario. So they're planned periods of time off. Now, too frequent, let's look at it both ways. If your training is too frequent and you don't have enough rest, then you don't have enough time to recover from the increased amount of training. But if you have too much time off, then you've actually not built in enough challenge and stress to require the amount of recovery time that you've given your body. So your body adapts to this resting state and it regresses and it begins to reverse to its pre-training capabilities. So it's a balancing act. And for your typical performer, anywhere between 3 and 5 days of training, with the other days being off for rest days or recovery days, that seems to be a good balance. Of course, it does depend on age, it does depend on your current level of fitness and your sport and the intensity of your training sessions, but 3 to 5 seems to be a good balance. For an elite performer, where they're probably focused more heavily on their diet and nutrition and how they can optimize their recovery windows, they'll probably be able to put in 6, 7, 8, 9 training sessions a week and manage it absolutely fine. But on the face of it, rest and recovery, it's very important to allow for this period of breakdown to turn into a period of improvements and adaptation. If we don't include rest and recovery, that's where we start to lead to overtraining. Too much in too short a space of time with not enough time off. And gradually, that's that red curve that we looked with progressive overload. Gradually, our ability decreases despite us training more. So I just mentioned this word here, adaptation or adaptation. Now, this is to do with our body getting better. So it's a combination of two principles, really, of progressive overload and rest and recovery. Because adaptation means that in time, our body will improve. It will get to the point where our body can handle the stress and level of challenge that we put it under regularly. So if our level of challenge plateaus, our level of fitness is going to plateau as well. New stress breaks our body down. The same stress maintains the capabilities of our body. So this idea here of just persisting with the same training doesn't lead to progress. It is that overload, it's that breakdown, it's that challenge that forces our body to get better. It's this opportunity to repair that leads to us improving. So we need to go through periods of being weaker, being worn out, because we bounce back stronger. We bounce back better. So when designing our training plan, we need to consider our progressive overload because of the principle of adaptation. If we just do the same thing over and over, what's that phrase? If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. So if you do the same training, you'll get the same results over and over. If anything, you might start to regress because you become more skillful. You become more economical in your movements. So you expend less energy. Think about ace face and skillful performance. You expend less energy. There's less calorie output. There's less strain on the body because you just become more technically better at performing whatever training drill that you've set yourself. Individual needs. So we've got RAI, individual needs, similar to specificity. But the way I see it being different is specificity is you're looking at the sport and the role that you play in sport and how your approach to your sport can be different to someone else approaching the same sport. Individual needs is a lot more holistic. So your age, your gender, your work-life balance, your family commitments, your priority list of sport and other factors and other hobbies. So older performers will likely require more rest periods, for example. Does the training plan take that into account? Are the person's motivations for social gain? Or is it physical gain? Or is it mental gain from being stimulated with strategy and tactics? Or, like this middle pair here, are they performing sport because it's a chance to get out and about and to socialise with people that they wouldn't normally speak to? Is the personality, in the terms of personality, are they introverted or are they extroverted? Do they like being by themselves and they get enjoyment from that? Or do they thrive off being in a group environment? Does their training plan meet or match their personality? So individual needs. What is the person like? What are they wanting to get out of training? When we work that out, we can start to design a training plan that suits them better. We cater to their individual needs. And lastly, diminishing returns. So we've done sport, RAID, just got fit to do, diminishing returns. Now, this is down to, a lot of it comes down to percentages and input versus output, rate of progression, all of those sorts of terms. The line that you need is progress in any component of fitness tapers as the performer approaches their physiological limit. Humans in general have physiological limits. Individuals have their own personal physiological limits. Try as hard as I like, I'm probably never going to get close. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to get to even being close to Usain Bolt's world record 100-meter sprint. No chance, because I haven't got that split, that ratio of fast twitch muscle fibers. I haven't got the biomechanical principles that will allow me to achieve that world record. You know, if we look at it that way, there's hundreds of people who are just percentage points away from being the same physiologically as world record holders. But despite their training, despite their motivation, they can't beat it. They can't get to that same level because they've reached their physiological limit. And that's what diminishing returns refers to. When you first start off learning and training and improving your body, well, at the moment, you've got loads of room for improvement because you're at a bog standard, pretty low average level. So you've got a long way to improve. So you can make massive gains really quickly, really early on with very little input. You go from doing absolutely nothing to doing a little bit of something and you get massively better. Now imagine if that same rate of progress carried on for the elite performers who trained 2 times a day. We'd have some insane components of fitness being displayed. Now, I'm not taking anything away from what is displayed by the world's best, But for the amount of hours they put in, they're not that much different as a percentage to your average performer. And look at a sub 10-second 100-meter sprint is phenomenal. But I reckon I could probably take 2 or 3 seconds off my sprint time with 2 or 3 months of focused speed training. I could probably run it in about 14, 15 seconds at the moment. 2 or 3 months, I reckon I'd be able to get that down to perhaps 12 or 13 seconds. And I could do that pretty quickly, 2 or 3 months. But it would probably take me 2 or 3 years after that to get 12 seconds down to 11 and a half. And I probably wouldn't be able to go any lower than that, despite all the hours that I could put into it. So we see this tapering, this lack of return on our inputs into training. And suddenly, for the elite, and looking at this last point down here, those marginal gains, those 0.5, those 1% gains, very difficult to achieve for the amount of input into training. Whereas for the novice performer, it was not unheard of to achieve 10, 15, 20% gains in the first month. So we see this tapering off, this diminishing return on investment into training. And that is RAID. So if you haven't already, fill in your RAID box on your activity sheet. You've got rest and recovery and overtraining, adaptation, individual needs, diminishing returns, and the definitions there in the center. Remember, get a trigger word or a trigger phrase that will help you recall these definitions. So for rest and recovery, I'd probably put in time off. For adaptation, I'd probably say get used to things. Individual needs, I'd probably put down age and gender. Diminishing returns, I would put down the word taper. Right, let's move on to our final acronym or mnemonic. We've got FIT principles, FITT. Now, first off, we've got frequency, then we've got intensity, then we've got time, and we have type. Now, here you can see on the screen this picture. This is an example of a periodized training program. Now, hopefully by now you've either started or you're partway through or you've got some exposure to the training program that you need for your PAP or your performance assessment. And hopefully you've done it in a periodized way. Well, this is an example of that. Notice how these boxes are very similar to what we looked at. They're color coordinated according to the phase of the season. We've got the months along the top broken down into individual squares that represent individual training sessions. This big macro look at big performance outcome goals. And we break these down into smaller blocks, manageable blocks. And the FIT principle can help with that. So the ones that have gone before, Sport RAID, they're more holistic. They're principles of training to consider sort of throughout the whole training program experience, especially at the start. The FIT principles are more for your daily, session by session principles. You need to make sure that each week incorporates these four. To start with, we're going to look at frequency, which is quite simply how regularly you train each week. Once a week, 3 times a week, 6 times a week. Too many can lead to that idea of overtraining if we don't build in enough time for rest and recovery. Too few, and we don't get to incorporate progressive overload. Because by the time we've broken our body down and recovered, it's on its way back down again. It's repaired itself, it hasn't been challenged, so then it readapts to its lack of challenge. So we don't want that reversibility to set in between our training sessions. We don't want too many to feel exhausted and worn out, but we don't want too few that we don't build good habits. So frequency, the regularity, that would be your word there, the trigger word, regularity. Intensity, how hard our training session is, or in other words, how close to maximum capacity does a training session push us? Now this could be measured, this will flash up here in a moment, it could be measured in terms of our 1 rep max. So if we're dealing with weights or resistance training or sprint speeds or things like that, what's our maximum output capability? Is the deadlift max 100 kilograms? Is it 150 kilograms? The bicep curl, is it 30 kilograms or is it 20 kilograms? If we work out our 1 rep max, we can start to work out the percentage of that we choose to work at throughout the training session. Different percentages of that bring about different benefits. Think back to your components of fitness. Endurance is low contractile force multiple times without fatigue. So this chap here training, no offense intended, but there's some pretty small weights. And he's got some pretty small arms as far as weightlifting goes. But he's probably developing his muscular endurance because that's a low weight in terms of his maximum capability. Whereas if you lift a higher intensity fewer times, well, you're producing maximal or close to maximal contractile outputs. You'll be developing power and strength. In terms of aerobic endurance and continuous or fartlek training types, we can base it on heart rate. Now, if we take the rough estimate of 220 minus your age being your maximum heart rate, we can have that figure in mind and then create a threshold that we want our heart rate to be in. Roughly speaking, we want somewhere between 70 and 80% to be developing aerobic endurance. Between 60 and 70%, well, that's a good zone that utilizes fat stores around the body. Above 80% is when we start to build in sort of speed endurance and anaerobic capabilities. So we can select how hard we work as a percentage of our maximum capabilities. And then by doing that, we can target different components of fitness. Time. Now, time, I know it's linked in some ways to frequency, but think of it as micro timing. Frequency is day by day. Timing is actually in the session. So how much time is given over to work? How much time is given over to rest periods? If we build in fewer reps, then obviously we're going to be working for less time. So we can afford to work harder for that reduced period of time. If we lower the intensity, we won't fatigue as quickly. Therefore, we can increase the length of time that we're working. If we want to challenge our recovery systems, then we shrink how much recovery time we've got between one exercise and the next. So we can manipulate these times to, again, alter the focus of the training session. We can alter the timings to target different components of fitness and improve recovery times. We can force either aerobic work or anaerobic work, both of which can be used in different amounts depending on your sporting context. And lastly, we have type. As you can see, we've got someone walking, jogging, running a little bit faster, and resistance training. So we've got loads of training methods. Hopefully by now you've already gone through those, so you've got a clear understanding of what they are. But we can mix these up because we know that each training type can target different components of fitness, are suited to different personalities, are suited to different budgets or accessibility factors, such as location, equipment, age. So by altering or planning to alter the type of training, we can keep it varied so we can avoid tedium, and we can target a wider range of components of fitness to avoid that idea of adaptation. If we just went for jogs, yes, we would get to a level where we can jog for hours at a time, no issues. But what happens when you go on a bike for the first time and you go for a cycle? Your muscles are so well tuned for running that they can't respond to being on a bike. So type, we keep it varied to avoid tedium, to focus on certain components of fitness, and to avoid that adaptation and that plateau. So on your sheet, make sure you have got frequency, intensity, time, and type written down, along with a trigger word or a trigger phrase. So it could be regularity, frequency. It could be to do with a percent of max for intensity. Time could be work/rest, and then type could be, maybe put down a couple of different types of training. But that is your third acronym there. So you've got sport, RAID, and FIT. So if you haven't already, fill in those boxes up at the top. But now, because you've got those definitions, I'd like you to start activity 2, which is to fill in the blanks. So read through that middle section of the sheet and think which principle is the sentence or the example referring to. Add that into the blank and you'll start to build up this bigger and deeper understanding of principles of training in action. So either pause the video and do that now, or hang around until the end, because we're going to carry on. So last but not least, how can we evaluate the importance of each principle of training so that we can improve the quality of a training program? So we've got 2 case studies. The first one is someone approaching it for general health. So specificity. How could someone approaching training to improve general health incorporate specificity? Well, if they haven't got a particular focus in mind, then the opposite should be true. We should be targeting all muscles at all intensities. Progressive overload, not too important, because there's nothing specific in mind in a certain time frame. There's no rush. Now, you could argue, is that a good thing? Smart target setting is important. Being time-bound keeps you accountable and forces rapid progress. But what if the person's motivation or personality actually isn't that fussed about it? It's not a massive priority. Just general health and well-being, emotional, mental, social, and physical. If that's the goal, then we don't need too much progressive overload, just some. Enough to avoid reversibility. We need to be training frequently enough to avoid reversibility. Tedium is probably a massive thing to consider. If we want someone who isn't training for a sport, they probably haven't got this intrinsic motivation to pursue it, and they're not willing to go through the grit and the horrible, hard training sessions to make marginal gains. They're there for enjoyment. They're there for the social factor, and if they get some form of physical benefit out of it as well, even better. So we should incorporate as much variety and change and interest as possible. Frequency, 3 to 4 sessions a week, in line with government guidelines and recommendations. It's probably not going to be their number 1, 2, or even 3, or third, I should say, priority. So we should fit the training program around everything else. Think back to RAID for individual needs. What have they got to do each week before they even think about doing some training? Family commitments, work commitments, other hobbies. Then we take the training program and we make it fit. So they don't feel overworked, they don't feel stressed. It should be an addition to their week, not a hindrance. Intensity. Hard enough to create a challenge, because with any sort of challenge that we can overcome, we get that sense of satisfaction. Very important for mental well-being and emotional well-being. Feeling content and happy and satisfied with efforts producing results. If someone's not too fussed about what those results are, though, then we don't need to work someone so hard and run the risk of them becoming injured or demotivated. Time. Again, it goes back to their individual needs. We make it suit their existing lifestyle. So it won't need to be all day or hours after hours of video analysis and movement analysis, not if general health is the overall goal. So long enough to suit their commitments and also elicit some challenge and overload. And then type, very important if we think of the variation that we want them to experience. If we're not adding in too much overload either, we definitely don't want adaptation to set in. I think of that A from RAID. We don't want adaptation to set in by constantly doing the same exercises in the same gym over and over. So where possible, keep it mixed up. Don't give the body a chance to adapt to one level of challenge in one sporting context. So our second case study, we're going to look at an elite shot putter. Specificity. Now this person has now got, yes, they're in athletics, but if we were to get specific about shot put, well, they need explosive strength. They need upper body power. They need pushing actions. So when we're designing the training plan, that should definitely be high up on the list of priorities of what we target in our daily training sessions. Progressive overload. This person here, they probably have aspirations of national representation, possibly Olympics, world championships. How long have they got in their peak? No, this chap here, potentially maybe late teens, maybe early 20s. How long has he got until he starts to deteriorate? Probably only 6 or 7 years before the next batch of youth players or youth athletes would start to rival him. So he needs to make sure that any of his biggest, loftiest goals are set in a 4 or 5 year time plan. How can he periodize from that? How can he incorporate enough progressive overload to reach that target without injuring himself? He definitely won't want reversibility. So no off season. Well, obviously he'll have off seasons, but he'll need to make sure that he doesn't dip so much at any point that he loses some of his training gains. Tedium. Now this is an interesting one. With our previous case study, if general health was the goal, then we need to keep the enjoyment there. But with an elite sports performer in a specific sporting context, they probably have this inner drive, which is big enough and powerful enough to take them through the monotony of some important trainings. So video analysis, slow motion, biomechanics, constant repetition of the same drill-like skill action. If they can handle that because they have the inner drive, they're not going to get bored because they're obviously pursuing it because they love it. So not as important, but still a factor to consider to make sure that there isn't that overkill. Frequency. If they are professional, then they probably have the funding or the sponsorship to dedicate their whole week towards improvements. Now, we need to build in rest, recovery. We need to build in, time for them to actually recover. But that doesn't mean to say that they can't complete 10 or 15 training sessions in a week, but 7 or 8 of them are theoretical or low intensity. They could be active recovery or flexibility training sessions. So the frequency is going to be far higher. The intensity, it has to match their goal. It has to match their sporting situation. And for shot put, it's speed, it's power, it's strength. Well, in actual performances, they are working at their maximum. Therefore, their training should mimic this. They should be constantly training in and developing and pushing and increasing their maximum capability. But with that, going there to frequency and the next one, time, with that, they will need to build in enough time, both in the session to recover their anaerobic system, and enough time between high intensity training sessions for protein synthesis to happen, for muscular hypertrophy to happen, for those sore muscles to repair themselves and be strong again before they put them through 90, 95, 100% intensity drills again. And then type. They need to be very focused on choosing the training types which improve the components of fitness that they need. Now, we've already spoken about how time isn't on this person's side. They have these massive goals that they have to race through their progress in order to meet. They haven't got time to mix and match different training types because they'll have more fun. They have to sacrifice that to stay focused and prioritize the types of training that elicit developments in the components of fitness that they need, that are essential for their sport. All the while keeping in mind overtraining, boredom, monotony. So it could be that every now and then there is a little bit of an enjoyment factor to sort of relieve a little bit of stress, to act as a distraction before high intensity focused training starts once again. Which brings us to your last activity, where they're in the box down at the bottom there. Hopefully you can see, but if not, download it and you'll definitely be able to see. There's a bit of a case study there of a performer who has goals and is going through some training, but their coach has made some mistakes. So read the case study, try and identify which principles of training have been ignored by the coach. And then the second part of that is, what should the coach do differently? How could they alter their approach to this performance training program to elicit better progress, to make it more realistic? So give that activity a go, either now or, well, I think we have reached the end of this lesson anyway, so we're going to be stopping anyway. But yeah, download the worksheet, and you've got those 3 activities there, those acronym boxes, the fill in the blanks, and then the case study at the end. And if you do all of those, hopefully by the end of that and the end of this, you now know the sport, RAID, and FIT principles of training, the definitions that go along with them, and also the ability of how, or the ability to evaluate the importance of principles of training in a variety of different contexts. And that is that. So I hope you found that useful. That was principles of training. Obviously, carry on working through the other lessons and masterclasses and PowerPoints and activities within this learning zone, and you'll be right on your way to improving that theory. So hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.